The autumn wind carried with it the scent of decay and dying things, sweeping across the grounds of Ashwood Hall in great gusts that sent copper leaves spiraling through the air like bitter memories given form. The sky hung low and grey above the estate, a perpetual shroud that seemed fitting for a house where hope had long ago retreated into shadows and silence. Lady Catherine Sinclair stood at the window of the morning room, her slender fingers resting against the cool glass as she watched the garden surrender to the season's melancholy, and thought, as she did every day at this hour, that the world outside perfectly reflected the landscape of her heart. She was 23 now, though she felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with the weight of shame carried so long it had become part of her very skeleton. 7 years had passed since that terrible evening when Viscount Hartley had sent his regrets, as though he were declining a dinner invitation rather than destroying a girl's future on the very eve of their betrothal announcement. And in those 7 years, Catherine had learned to make herself small, to move through rooms like a ghost, to expect nothing because nothing was all that society deemed her worthy to receive. Her aunt, the Dowager Lady Ashwood, loved her fiercely, but could not undo what had been done, could not erase the whispers that followed Catherine whenever she dared venture beyond these walls. The girl too flawed to wed, they called her, though no one could say precisely what her flaw had been, except that a man of good standing had looked at her and found her wanting. The servants knew the story, of course, and though they were kind to her face, Catherine sometimes caught the pitying glances, heard the hushed conversations that ceased when she entered a room. She had constructed her days with careful precision, a routine of quiet dignity that masked the profound melancholy beneath. Morning tea, in this very room, correspondence with her aunt's friends, who still tolerated her presence, long walks through the garden regardless of weather, needlework in the afternoon, reading in the evening, and always, the knowledge that this was her life now and forever, that she would grow old in this house, useful to her aunt until the dear woman passed, and then merely tolerated by whatever relation inherited the estate. Marriage was not a possibility she allowed herself to contemplate, for what man would want a woman publicly deemed unworthy by another? She had been examined and found lacking at 16, and the verdict, it seemed, was permanent and irreversible, carved into her reputation as deeply as words chiseled into stone. Her aunt had insisted she attend the county assembly, had pressed Catherine's hand and spoken with such gentle firmness that refusal would have been churlish, and so Catherine found herself standing at the edge of the gathering in the assembly hall on a cold November evening, dressed in a gown of deep plum that her aunt had commissioned, but which Catherine suspected made her look like she was in mourning, which perhaps she was mourning for a life that had never been hers and never would be. The room glowed with candlelight, warm and golden against the darkness outside, filled with familiar faces, who greeted her with that peculiar mix of pity and discomfort that had become the background music of her existence, and she was preparing to count the minutes until a respectable departure, when a ripple of awareness moved through the crowd like wind across water, heads turning toward the entrance, where a man stood removing his gloves with movements that suggested both refinement and restraint. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Thornfield. Catherine knew who he was before anyone whispered his name, for there was something about him that commanded attention without demanding it. A man perhaps in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black evening clothes that only emphasized the severity of his bearing. His eyes were dark, almost black in the candlelight, set in a face that was handsome in the way that cliffs are handsome, all sharp angles and uncompromising lines, with a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. His hands, she noticed as he handed his gloves to a servant, were scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who had fought and survived, and society's whispers reached her even across the room. He had served in foreign wars, had seen things that changed a man, had returned to England 2 years ago, but kept mostly to his estates, rarely attending such gatherings. People approached him with deference tinged with something that looked remarkably like fear, and Catherine found herself watching from her peripheral position, fascinated despite herself by this man who seemed to carry solitude around him like a cloak. Then, as though her attention had weight enough to draw his, the Duke's gaze moved across the room and found her watching, and their eyes met in a moment that Catherine would later remember as the instant everything began to shift. There was recognition in his look, though they had never met, as though he saw something in her that resonated with something in himself. He spoke quietly to Lord Pembroke, the Assembly's host, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face, and she watched as Pembroke answered, watched as the Duke's expression changed from curiosity to something darker and far more dangerous. She knew without hearing the words that Pembroke was relating her story, explaining who she was and what had been done to her, expecting perhaps that the Duke would nod with understanding and turn his attention elsewhere, but instead, Alexander Blackwood's jaw tightened, his scarred hands flexed at his sides, and his eyes, when they returned to Catherine, held something that made her breath catch in her throat, not pity, which she had learned to recognize in all its degrading forms, but fury on her behalf, cold and controlled and absolutely implacable. Lord Pembroke performed the introduction with visible bewilderment, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed assembly room as he presented the Duke of Thornfield to Lady Catherine Sinclair, and Catherine found herself curtsying to this formidable man, whose dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her forget, for a moment, to breathe. "Lady Catherine," the Duke said, his voice low and resonant, carrying the trace of an accent she could not quite place, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" The room seemed to hold its collective breath. 7 years had passed since Catherine had danced at any gathering, 7 years since anyone had publicly sought her company in such a manner, and she felt the weight of every watching eye as she placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor as the musicians, after a moment of startled hesitation, began a waltz. His hand at her waist was firm and proper. His other hand held hers with a gentleness that belied his warrior's scars, and as they began to move, she felt as though she had stepped into some dreamscape where the rules that governed her existence had suddenly ceased to apply. "You waltz beautifully, Lady Catherine," he said, and there was nothing of pity or condescension in his tone, only simple statement of fact. "I have not danced in a very long time, Your Grace," she replied carefully, keeping her eyes fixed on his cravat rather than meeting his gaze, afraid of what she might see there, afraid of what she might reveal. "Then society has been deprived of something lovely," he said, and the words were formal enough to be proper yet carried an undertone that made her pulse quicken in ways she did not entirely trust. They spoke little as they moved through the figures of the waltz. He asked about her residence. She answered with cautious brevity. He mentioned the beauty of the countryside. She agreed with equal caution, but beneath the careful formality of their words ran a current of something electric and unnamed, a charge in the air between them that Catherine had never felt before and did not know how to interpret. He spoke to her as though the scandal had never occurred, as though she was simply a lady of good standing, worthy of his attention and respect, and the intoxicating feeling of being treated as valuable warred in her chest, with the suspicion that this could not possibly be genuine, that he must want something from her, that this was perhaps some elaborate game whose rules she did not understand, and whose ending would leave her even more damaged than before. The waltz ended too soon and lasted far too long, and as the Duke escorted her from the floor with her hand still resting on his arm, the assembly room doors opened to admit a late arrival, and Catherine's entire body went cold with a visceral, cellular recognition, even before her eyes confirmed what her instincts already knew. Viscount Hartley had entered, his wife on his arm, the woman he had married 3 months after sending his regrets to Catherine, the woman he had clearly preferred all along. Catherine felt the old shame rise in her throat like bile, felt her carefully constructed composure threaten to shatter, felt the familiar urge to flee, to hide, to disappear into the walls, but the Duke's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a steady pressure that anchored her in place, and when she dared glance up at his face, she saw that he was watching Viscount Hartley with the same cold, controlled fury she had glimpsed earlier, his jaw set like granite and his eyes tracking every movement with the predatory attention of a hawk observing prey. The Duke called at Ashwood Hall 3 days after the assembly, arriving in the afternoon when the November light was already beginning to fade and the bare trees cast long shadows across the gravel drive, and Catherine watched from the drawing-room window as he dismounted, handed his horse to a groom, and approached the house with that same controlled purpose she had observed at the assembly. Her aunt received him with bewildered courtesy, her elderly hands fluttering nervously as she inquired about his journey and offered refreshment, and when the Duke stated plainly that he had come to request permission to call upon Lady Catherine with the intention of courtship, Her aunt's teacup rattled audibly in its saucer. Permission was granted because how does one refuse a duke? And so began a series of visits that Catherine experienced in a state of perpetual confusion, unable to reconcile this man's evident interest with everything she believed about her own ruined status. They sat on the terrace despite the chill, her aunt positioned at a discreet but proper distance with her embroidery, and the Duke spoke to Catherine of his estates, of his travels, of books he had read and places he had seen, treating her as though her opinions mattered, as though her thoughts had value. "You have seen war, Your Grace," she said during one of these carefully chaperoned conversations, needing to understand something of who he was beneath the formidable exterior. "I have," he replied, his dark eyes steady on hers, "and I have seen what it means to be judged by others who know nothing of what you have endured or survived." There was something in his voice that suggested he understood her particular form of survival, that he recognized the kind of war that left no visible scars, but carved trenches through the soul nonetheless. He brought her books of poetry on his subsequent visits. Volumes, he said, reminded him of their conversations, and she was startled to discover he had actually listened when she mentioned her love of Wordsworth, had remembered and acted upon such a small detail. He looked at her when they spoke with an attention that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world, as though everything she said mattered deeply to him, and gradually, despite every defensive instinct she had honed over 7 years, Catherine felt something beginning to soften in her chest, some frozen place starting to thaw under the steady warmth of his regard. Yet still she did not trust it, could not trust it, because why would a man of his standing and power pursue a woman society had branded as flawed, unless he wanted something she did not understand, unless this was some elaborate game whose ending would destroy her more thoroughly than Viscount Hartley's abandonment ever had. She watched him with wary fascination, this duke with scarred warrior's hands who spoke to her of honor and justice, who brought her poetry and looked at her as though she were precious, and she wondered what he truly wanted, what he truly saw when he looked at her, and whether she would survive the moment when he finally looked away. Weeks passed, autumn surrendering to the first cruel edges of winter, and the Duke's courtship continued with a steadiness that both comforted and terrified. Catherine, his presence at Ashwood Hall becoming as regular as the changing light, as inevitable as the frost that now silvered the morning grass. Society watched with growing speculation, whispers following Catherine whenever she ventured into the village or attended Sunday services, and she felt the weight of their collective scrutiny like a physical pressure against her skin, crushing and inescapable. She went to the modiste one grey December afternoon to collect a mended cloak, her aunt's companion accompanying her as chaperone, and while the shopkeeper wrapped the garment, Catherine heard the voices of 2 ladies in the adjacent room, their conversation carrying clearly through the thin wall, with the particular projection of those who believe themselves unheard. "The Duke of Thornfield and Lady Catherine Sinclair," one voice said with a tone of amused speculation. "One must wonder what arrangement exists between them, for surely he cannot intend actual marriage to a woman of her reputation." The second voice, lower but no less cruel, replied with a laugh that cut like glass. "My dear, it's perfectly obvious she's warming his bed until he tires of her. What else would a duke want with damaged goods?" Catherine felt the words pierce through her chest with the precision of a blade, finding its mark between ribs, felt the air leave her lungs, felt the familiar shame rise up to drown her, and she left the shop without collecting her cloak, without speaking, without seeing, her vision tunneling to a point of pure survival as she made her way back to Ashwood Hall and retreated immediately to her room, telling her aunt she had a headache and wished not to be disturbed. She did not come down for dinner, did not respond when her aunt knocked gently at her door, and when the Duke arrived the following afternoon for his customary visit, she sent word through a servant that she was indisposed and could not receive him. He did not leave. She heard his voice downstairs, heard her aunt's worried responses, and then she heard his footsteps on the stairs and he was at her door, knocking with a firmness that brooked no refusal. She opened it because she had never been able to deny him anything, and he took one look at her face and entered without waiting for invitation, closing the door behind him with enough space left for propriety, but with a disregard for convention that would have scandalized the very ladies whose words had wounded her. "What has happened?" he demanded, and his voice was controlled, but she could hear the edge of something dangerous beneath it, the warrior barely leashed. Catherine felt something break inside her, some final defense crumbling, and she turned on him with all the accumulated confusion and fear of the past weeks. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion she could no longer contain. "What do you want from me? What is this truly about?" He stood very still, his dark eyes fixed on hers, and for a long moment he said nothing, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Then he spoke, his voice low and intense, each word carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I see your worth, Catherine. I see your strength, the injustice that was done to you, the grace with which you have carried an undeserved burden. I see who you are beneath what they have tried to make you believe you are." But he did not say he loved her, did not offer the words that might have anchored her, and Catherine remained suspended in uncertainty, afraid to hope, afraid to believe, afraid that when he finally looked away, she would be left with even less than she had before he arrived, to reshape her carefully ordered world of managed expectations and protective isolation. Lord Pembroke's estate blazed with candlelight against the December darkness, every window glowing as carriages arrived in steady procession, disgorging their passengers into the cold night air, where breath misted and jewels glittered, and voices carried on the wind, with that particular quality of forced gaiety that characterized events where social warfare was anticipated. Catherine arrived on the Duke's arm, her gloved hand resting lightly on his sleeve, and she felt the weight of every eye in the entrance hall turned toward them as they were announced, felt the ripple of speculation move through the assembled guests like wind through wheat, bending and swaying in their collective attention. The Duke's presence beside her was solid and unyielding, his hand covering hers briefly in a gesture of reassurance before they moved into the drawing-room where pre-dinner drinks were being served, and Catherine saw immediately that Viscount Hartley was present with his wife, the woman who had once been Miss Eleanor Ashford and was now Lady Hartley, her face still pretty but marked with a certain hardness around the mouth that spoke of disappointed expectations. Dinner was announced, and they processed into the dining room according to rank, which meant the Duke was seated near the head of the table, and Catherine, despite being his acknowledged companion, was placed further down according to her father's more modest barony, a subtle social cut that everyone present understood and that made her cheeks burn with familiar shame. She found herself seated across from Lord Edmund Rothford, a young man of perhaps 25 with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having suffered consequences, and halfway through the second course he turned to his neighbour with a voice pitched to carry and said, "One must be cautious in society these days, for there are women whose reputations precede them, making it rather difficult to know how one ought to behave in their presence." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Catherine felt her hands still on her cutlery, felt the familiar paralysis of shame begin to creep through her limbs, but before she could draw breath, she heard the Duke's voice cut through the ambient conversation with the precision of a blade, cold and utterly controlled. "Lord Rothford, I find your conversation as tedious as your manners are lacking, and I suggest you spend the remainder of this meal in silence, contemplating which is the greater failing." The table fell quiet, every guest suddenly fascinated by their plates, and Lord Rothford's face flushed crimson, but he said nothing more, cowed by the Duke's tone and the promise of danger that underlay it. The meal continued in strained formality, and when the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, Catherine felt the tension coil tighter in her chest, knowing that the worst was yet to come, and indeed, after the gentlemen rejoined them, Sir Philip Crawley, a baronet of comfortable means and comfortable arrogance, approached her where she stood near the window, and said with wine-loosened tongue and an insolent smile, "My dear Lady Catherine, you must tell me the secret of capturing a duke's attention so thoroughly, for I confess I would not have thought your particular assets would appeal to a man of such exacting standards, unless of course your availability extends more broadly than currently advertised." The words were barely spoken before the Duke was there, his movement so swift and silent that Sir Philip actually startled, and the Duke's voice when he spoke was soft and more terrifying for its quietness. "You will meet me at dawn, Crawley, and bring your second, for you have just purchased your opportunity to defend that insult with your life." The drawing-room seemed to hold its collective breath, and Sir Philip's face drained of colour as the reality of what he had provoked settled over him. But there was no retreating now, no apology that would suffice, and he nodded jerkily and stammered something about his second calling upon the Duke's. And Catherine stood frozen as the first duel was set in motion, as the consequence of society's cruelty finally found its form in ritual violence, and she did not know whether to feel horror or a terrible, forbidden hope that perhaps someone would finally demand payment for what had been done to her. Catherine learned of the impending duel not from the Duke himself but from her aunt, who appeared at breakfast the next morning pale and trembling with a note that had been delivered at first light, and Catherine's hands shook as she read the formal language that confirmed what she had feared from the moment Sir Philip's words had left his mouth and the Duke's cold fury had answered them. She went to Thornfield House immediately, propriety abandoned in the face of her desperation, and when the butler hesitated, she pushed past him with a force born of panic, finding the Duke in his study reviewing the particulars of the meeting with his second, and he looked up at her entrance with an expression that softened only marginally when he saw her distress. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice breaking on the words, and she crossed the room to stand before his desk like a supplicant before a judge. "Please, Alexander, I am begging you, do not fight for me. Do not risk yourself for my sake. I am not worth bloodshed. I am not worth your life. I am already ruined, and nothing you do can change what society believes of me." He stood slowly, coming around the desk to face her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw his careful control fracture, saw something raw and fierce break through the surface of his composed exterior. "You are worth everything," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion he no longer tried to contain. "You are worth every risk, every consequence, every drop of blood that might be spilled in defense of your honor, and I will not allow the cruelty of small-minded fools to go unanswered simply because you have been taught to believe you deserve their contempt." She tried to speak, but he continued, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders with a gentleness that belied the intensity of his words. "I will fight, Catherine, and I will win, and perhaps then you might begin to understand that your worth is not determined by those who abandoned you, but by the truth of who you are." The duel took place at dawn, in a field outside the village boundaries, mist rising from the frozen ground like the breath of ghosts, and Catherine learned of the details only afterward, though she spent those early morning hours on her knees in the chapel at Ashwood Hall, praying to a God she was not certain listened to women like her. The ritual unfolded, with the formal precision of a dance whose steps had been choreographed by centuries of masculine honor, the seconds conferring, the physician standing ready, the two men taking their positions back to back before pacing the prescribed distance across ground that crunched beneath their boots, with a sound like breaking bones. They turned, pistols raised, and in the suspended moment before the signal was given, Catherine would later imagine she could feel the weight of that silence, could sense the terrible potential of violence about to be unleashed in her name. The shots rang out almost simultaneously, and Sir Philip's ball went wide, his hand shaking too badly to aim true, but the Duke's aim was steady as stone, and his shot took Sir Philip in the shoulder with enough force to spin him around and drop him to his knees. The wound deliberate and precise, painful but not fatal, a statement written in gunpowder and blood. Word spread through the county with the speed of wildfire, carried by servants and gentlemen's gentlemen and the physician who had attended the fallen baronet, and Catherine sat in her drawing-room that afternoon, receiving the news with a strange numbness, torn between horror at what had been done and a forbidden, terrifying hope that perhaps the Duke's willingness to risk everything meant she truly did matter to him, that perhaps she was not merely a cause to champion, but a woman worth defending, worth fighting for, worth the danger he had faced in the cold dawn mist for the sake of her tarnished and impossible honor. 3 days after the first duel, Catherine attended a garden party at Mrs. Aldridge's estate with considerable reluctance, her presence secured only by the Duke's gentle insistence that she must not retreat into hiding despite the recent violence enacted in her name, and the afternoon was mild for December, with weak sunlight filtering through bare branches and ladies strolling the winter garden paths in their warmest pelisses, while gentlemen gathered near the conservatory smoking and discussing matters of politics and sport. Catherine stood near the fountain with her aunt, attempting to appear composed while acutely aware of the whispers that followed her movement through the party, and it was there that she overheard Lady Beatrice Holwell speaking to Mrs. Pemberton in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "One must admire the Duke's charitable nature, though I confess I cannot comprehend his attachment to second-hand goods when a man of his standing might have his pick of the season's finest, but perhaps he prefers what has already been examined and found wanting by others, as there is less mystery and therefore less disappointment in the transaction. The words struck Catherine like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and bringing the familiar heat of shame to her cheeks. But before she could retreat or compose any response, she saw the Duke detach himself from the group of gentlemen with the focused intensity of a predator who has spotted vulnerable prey, and he crossed the lawn with deliberate strides that brought him to stand before Lady Beatrice, with an expression of such cold fury that the lady's confident smile faltered and died. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent garden, "you have just insulted my intended, and I find I cannot allow such discourtesy to pass without consequence." The use of that word intended sent a shock through Catherine more powerful than any insult could deliver, for he had never before made such a public claim on her, had never defined their relationship with such unmistakable clarity before witnesses who would carry the news to every drawing-room in 3 counties. Lady Beatrice paled, her hand fluttering to her throat, and she stammered something about speaking in jest. But the Duke's attention had already shifted to her brother, Lord James Holwell, who had approached at the sound of raised voices. "Your sister has impugned the honor of the woman I intend to marry," the Duke informed him with terrible courtesy, "and I must demand that you either secure her immediate and public apology or meet me to defend her words with your life." Lord James, a man of perhaps 30 with more pride than sense, drew himself up with offended dignity and declared that his sister had spoken nothing but honest observation, that truth could not be considered insult, and that if the Duke chose to entangle himself with damaged goods, that was his own affair, but did not require the rest of society to pretend otherwise. The second duel was arranged before Catherine could even attempt to intervene, and though she tried to speak with the Duke privately that evening, he was immovable as stone, his jaw set and his eyes dark with purpose. And when they met at dawn 2 mornings later, in the same misted field, the Duke's shot grazed Lord James's arm with enough force to draw blood and send the man stumbling backward, and word spread through society with the speed of scandal that the Duke of Thornfield would tolerate no disrespect toward Lady Catherine Sinclair, that he had now fought twice in her defense and showed every indication of fighting again if provoked, and Catherine began to notice a subtle shift in how she was treated. Some ladies offering cautious nods of acknowledgement, some gentlemen stepping aside to let her pass with newfound deference, though she also sensed a growing resentment among certain members of society who viewed the Duke's methods as tyrannical, as if his demand for basic courtesy toward her was somehow an assault on their freedom to be cruel, and she remained caught between gratitude for his unwavering defense and a deepening confusion about what drove a man to such lengths for a woman society had already judged and found unworthy. Catherine's internal crisis deepened in the days following the second duel until it became a constant weight, pressing against her ribs with every breath, and she found herself unable to sleep through the nights, lying awake in her bed at Ashwood Hall, tormented by questions that circled her mind like carrion birds. Over a battlefield, did the Duke act from pity, from some misguided sense of chivalry toward a woman he viewed as a charitable cause, or was this about his own pride, his refusal to allow society to question his judgment in choosing to associate with her rather than any true regard for her as a person? She was grateful, desperately so, for his defense of her honor when no one else had cared to speak on her behalf for 7 long years. Yet the gratitude itself felt like another form of debt, another weight of obligation. And she could not bear the thought that he might be risking himself repeatedly out of stubbornness or aristocratic arrogance, rather than genuine feeling, could not endure being the cause of violence, even if he insisted she was not to blame. 3 days after Lord James Holwell's wounding, Catherine sent word to Thornfield House requesting a private audience, and when the Duke arrived at Ashwood Hall that afternoon, she met him not in the formal drawing-room, but in the winter garden where bare rose stems climbed the trellises like the skeletal remains of summer beauty, and she stood with her back to him for a long moment before turning to face him with a composure that cost her everything she had. "I must release you from whatever obligation you feel toward me," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands, which she clasped tightly before her. "I cannot bear being the cause of this violence, cannot live with the knowledge that men are being wounded, that blood is being spilled, that you are risking yourself again and again for my sake, and I would rather return to my quiet obscurity than watch you destroy yourself and others in defense of a reputation that is already beyond salvation." The Duke's expression darkened, and he closed the distance between them with 2 long strides, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders as he looked down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are not the cause, Catherine," he said, and his voice carried a fierce conviction that seemed to resonate in her very bones. "Their cruelty is the cause, their vicious determination to punish you eternally for the sin of having been abandoned by a coward, their refusal to see your worth or allow you any path to redemption. I am merely the consequence of their choices, the price they must pay for their casual destruction of a woman who deserved better from all of them." She shook her head, tears threatening despite her determination to remain composed, and whispered that she did not understand why he cared so much, why a duke would stake his reputation and safety on a woman society had already judged unworthy, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw his careful control fracture completely as he drew her to sit beside him on the stone bench and spoke in a voice rough with emotion about a woman he had loved years ago, before the wars, a young woman of gentle birth whose reputation had been destroyed by rumors that were never proven but never forgotten, and how he had been too young and too concerned with his own standing to defend her publicly, how she had died of a fever while still branded as fallen, and how he had carried the guilt of his failure ever since, had sworn to himself that if he ever had the chance to protect someone facing such injustice, he would not fail again, would not allow society's cruelty to go unchallenged, would stand as the defender he should have been before. And when he looked at Catherine across that assembly room, he had seen not just her situation, but his chance at redemption, his opportunity to be the man he should have been then, though he admitted in a voice barely above a whisper that it had become so much more than that now, that somewhere in their conversations and careful courtship he had begun to see her not as a cause, but as a woman whose strength and grace had captured something in him he had thought dead, and he asked her please not to send him away, not to deny him the chance to be worthy of the man she believed him to be. The social season continued with a brittle tension that seemed to permeate every gathering, as though society itself held its breath, waiting to see how far the Duke of Thornfield would go in his defense of Lady Catherine Sinclair, and it was at a musical evening hosted by the Marchioness of Westerly that the fragile equilibrium finally shattered in the most devastating way possible. Catherine attended on the Duke's arm, and the evening had proceeded with careful civility until the intermission, when she found herself near the refreshment table and became aware of a presence at her shoulder. Viscount Hartley, older now and somehow diminished, his face bearing the marks of a man who had not found the happiness he had anticipated when he abandoned a 16-year-old girl on the eve of their betrothal. "Lady Catherine," he said quietly, and his voice carried a tremor she had never heard in their youth. "I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment." She turned to face him with her heart beating wildly against her ribs, and she saw in his eyes something that might have been regret or merely discomfort at the social shift that had elevated her beyond his reach. "I have wanted to tell you," he continued, his words coming in a rush as though he had rehearsed them many times, "that I am sorry for what I did those years ago, for my cowardice in abandoning our understanding, for allowing my family's objections and my own weakness to override what I knew to be dishonorable, and I hope that you might find it in your heart to forgive." But he never finished his apology because the Duke appeared at Catherine's side with the sudden inevitability of a thunderstorm, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop as he looked at Hartley with an expression of such barely contained fury that several nearby guests stepped back instinctively. "You will not speak to her," the Duke said in a voice that carried across the music room with terrible clarity, and Catherine saw Hartley's face flush with a combination of shame and defensive pride. "I was merely offering an apology long overdue," Hartley said, drawing himself up with what dignity he could muster. "Surely even you cannot object to a gentleman attempting to make amends for past mistakes." The Duke's laugh was cold and without humor. "Amends? You believe that words spoken 7 years too late constitute amends for the destruction you wrought? For the years she spent in isolation and shame because you were too weak to stand against your family's prejudice?" Hartley's expression hardened, and Catherine saw the old arrogance resurface as he said, "I begin to think, Thornfield, that you are being manipulated by a woman of questionable virtue who has somehow convinced you to wage war on her behalf. and I wonder if you truly understand the nature of the attachment you are defending." The Duke's demand for satisfaction came before Catherine could draw breath, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade, and she knew with cold certainty that this duel would be different from the others, because this was not some thoughtless gossip or spiteful stranger, but the original architect of her ruin, and the weight of 7 years of injustice hung between the two men like a physical presence. That night, unable to sleep, Catherine went to the Duke in his study at Thornfield House and finally told him everything, not just the bare facts of her abandonment, but the full story of how Hartley had courted her with seeming devotion, how she had believed herself loved, how he had withdrawn without explanation the day before their betrothal was to be announced, and how she had spent years believing she must have been fundamentally flawed for him to leave so completely. And as she spoke, the Duke listened with an expression of such pain and rage on her behalf that she wept for the first time in his presence, and he held her while she finally mourned the girl she had been before shame had taught her to make herself small. The duel with Viscount Hartley was set for dawn on the 5th of November in Ashfield Meadow, a stretch of grey-green land that lay shrouded in morning mist like a burial shroud, and Catherine had not slept at all through the night, lying in her bed at Ashwood Hall listening to the wind rattle the window-panes while her mind replayed every moment of the evening when the Duke had held her as she wept and told her that Hartley would answer for what he had done. And though the Duke had forbidden her to attend the meeting, she had risen before first light and dressed in her darkest cloak and followed the carriage tracks through the cold November morning until she reached the edge of the meadow where she concealed herself behind a stand of bare oaks, her breath coming in white clouds as she watched the two men take their positions, with the surgeon and seconds standing at the prescribed distance. And she had never seen anything so terrible as the moment when the Duke and Hartley faced each other across that expanse of frost-silvered grass, with the weight of 7 years of injustice hanging between them like something physical and malevolent. Hartley looked pale and diminished in the grey dawn light, his face bearing the marks of a sleepless night, but there was still pride in the set of his shoulders, still that old arrogance that had allowed him to destroy a young girl's life without sufficient consequence, and Catherine felt her hands clench inside her cloak as she watched the men receive their pistols and heard the second call out, the terms of the engagement, in a voice that seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness, and when the command came to take their positions, both men turned and began the slow count of paces that would determine whether this ended in blood or honor or death. The Duke moved with the controlled precision of a man who had faced death before and made peace with it, while Hartley's steps seemed less certain, and when they reached their marks and turned to face each other, Catherine saw on the Duke's face an expression she had never witnessed before, not rage, not hatred, but a cold and absolute judgment that seemed to pierce through all the years and all the excuses to the essential cowardice at the heart of what Hartley had done to her. The command to fire shattered the morning silence, and both men's pistols discharged simultaneously, smoke blooming in the cold air, and Catherine's heart stopped as she saw Hartley stagger backward with his hand clutching his side, while the Duke remained standing, utterly still with his weapon lowered. And she realized that Hartley had missed entirely, his shot going wide in his nervousness, while the Duke's bullet had torn through the Viscount's coat and grazed his ribs in a precise strike that could have killed, but had been deliberately measured to wound and warn rather than destroy. Hartley collapsed to his knees more from shock than injury, his face white as the mist, and the Duke walked slowly across the grass to stand over him with a terrible quiet authority, and though Catherine could not hear his words from her hiding place, she saw Hartley flinch as though struck and bow his head in complete defeat, and she understood that the Duke was delivering judgment, not just for the duel but for everything that had come before, for the abandonment and the shame and the years of isolation, and Hartley's public humiliation, in that moment, was more complete than any physical wound could have achieved. And as Catherine watched with her heart pounding and tears streaming down her cold cheeks, she felt something shift deep within herself, like the first crack in ice that has held fast through a long winter, and it was the beginning of believing, truly believing, that perhaps she had deserved defense all along, that perhaps the Duke's faith in her worth was not misplaced pity or aristocratic pride, but the recognition of something real and true that she had stopped being able to see in herself, and for the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to imagine that redemption might actually be possible. Autumn deepened into early winter, with that particular grey quality of light that makes the world seem suspended between seasons, and society remained bitterly divided in its response to the Duke of Thornfield's unprecedented defence of Lady Catherine Sinclair. For while some members of the aristocracy had begun to speak admiringly of his unwavering loyalty and the honourable nature of his campaign against those who had maligned an innocent woman, others whispered that he had become dangerously obsessed and that his willingness to meet any slight with pistols at dawn represented a challenge to the very social order that sustained their world. And it was these latter voices, resentful and defensive, and determined to prove that a duke could not simply remake society through force of will and superior marksmanship, that led to 4 more deliberate provocations over the following weeks, each more calculated than the last. The 4th duel came about when Mr. Geoffrey Ashton, a gentleman of middling rank but considerable spite, composed a crude limerick about Catherine that circulated through London's clubs and drawing-rooms until it reached the Duke's ears, and though Ashton attempted to claim it was merely jest, the Duke's demand for satisfaction was immediate and implacable, and they met on a bitter morning in late November, where the Duke's shot shattered Ashton's pistol arm and sent a clear message that words could wound as surely as bullets, and would be answered accordingly. The 5th duel followed within a fortnight when Captain Richard Vance, emboldened by brandy and the urging of his companions at White's, publicly questioned Catherine's virtue in terms so explicit that 3 separate witnesses felt compelled to inform the Duke. And though Vance was known as an excellent shot with military experience, he found himself facing a man whose precision was born not of practice but of absolute conviction, and the captain's shoulder bore the Duke's response for months afterward. The 6th duel arose from Lord Thomas Pemberton's suggestion at a dinner party that Catherine had somehow ensnared the Duke through unseemly means, that a woman of her compromised position must have employed feminine wiles of a questionable nature to secure the devotion of such a formidable man. And when these words reached the Duke, he appeared at Pemberton's residence that very evening, with cold fury in his eyes, and a challenge that could not be refused, and their meeting at dawn resulted in Pemberton taking a ball through his thigh that left him with a permanent limp and a permanent silence on the subject of the Duchess-to-be. The 7th and final duel came in mid-December, when Sir Charles Weatherby, drunk and defensive and resentful of the social upheaval the Duke had wrought, claimed loudly at Lady Winterton's ball that he had been offered Catherine's favours years ago, a lie so transparent and vile that even his own friends blanched at the telling. But the damage was done, and the Duke's challenge was delivered before Sir Charles could sober enough to realise the magnitude of his error, and their encounter in the frost-rimed field on the winter solstice was brief and brutal, with Sir Charles managing through sheer luck to nick the Duke's arm before taking a shot to his side that left him gasping in the frozen grass, while the Duke stood over him with an expression that promised death, if there was ever an 8th offence. And when word of this final duel spread through society like wildfire, there was at last a collective understanding that the Duke of Thornfield's patience had been tested to its uttermost limit, and that no one, not lord, nor lady, nor gentleman of any standing, would survive an attempt to continue the persecution of Lady Catherine Sinclair. After the 7th duel, society's resistance finally broke like a dam that had held against rising water for too long, and in the days following Sir Charles Weatherby's humiliation in the frozen field, no one, not in the drawing-rooms of Mayfair, nor the assembly halls of the countryside, nor the exclusive clubs where gentlemen gathered to drink and gossip, dared speak a single word against Lady Catherine Sinclair, for the Duke of Thornfield had made it devastatingly clear that such speech would be answered with powder and shot at dawn, and the collective memory of 7 wounded men served as a monument to his unwavering resolve. Yet victory came at a cost that Catherine had not fully comprehended until she arrived unannounced at Thornfield House 3 days after the final duel, and found the Duke alone in his study, with the winter afternoon light slanting through the tall windows and illuminating a man who looked profoundly weary in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He stood by the fireplace with one hand braced against the mantel and his head bowed, as though the weight of all he had done had finally settled upon his shoulders, and when he turned at the sound of her entrance, she saw in his dark eyes something she had never witnessed before, a vulnerability so complete it made her breath catch, for this was not the formidable warrior who had faced 7 men with unwavering precision, but rather a man who had borne the burden of violence, even when that violence was measured and just. And she understood in that moment that each duel had cost him something essential. Each meeting at dawn had required him to become a version of himself he would have preferred to leave behind in the battlefields of his past. She noticed then the blood-stained bandage wrapped around his left forearm where Sir Charles's lucky shot had grazed him, and without asking permission, she crossed the room and gently took his arm in her hands and began to unwrap the soiled linen with careful fingers while he watched her in silence. And as she worked, she felt the tremor in his muscles and the heat of his skin and the terrible intimacy of this moment when she was finally able to tend to him as he had defended her. And when the wound was revealed, a clean graze that had bled more than it had damaged, she cleaned it with water from the basin on his desk and bound it with fresh linen from her reticule, her hands steady even as her heart pounded with all the words she had never been able to speak. And when she finished, she looked up into his face and asked the question she had been afraid to voice through all the weeks of courtship and conflict. "Why me, truly?" And she watched as his careful control finally shattered like glass struck by stone, and he reached up with his uninjured hand to touch her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man who had just fought 7 duels, and his voice when he spoke was raw with emotion, long suppressed, as he told her that from the very first moment he had seen her standing at the edge of that assembly room 7 months ago, watching the world with eyes that held both sorrow and unbroken dignity. He had recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who had endured judgment and survived it, someone who had been diminished by others' cruelty, yet refused to diminish herself, someone whose quiet strength was worth more than all the shallow approval of a society that measured worth by reputation rather than character. And as Catherine listened to his confession, she felt something fundamental shift within her, like the final lock, opening on a door she had kept barred for 7 years. The Duke drew a shaking breath and spoke words that seemed to cost him everything he had left after 7 duels and months of careful restraint, telling Catherine that he loved her not because she needed rescue or because his pride demanded he defend what he had claimed, but because of who she was in the deepest essence of her being, because of the strength she had shown in enduring years of unjust shame without allowing it to make her cruel or bitter, because of the grace with which she had carried herself through a society that had branded her unworthy when the unworthiness belonged entirely to those who had judged her, because when he looked at her, he saw not a woman diminished by scandal, but a soul that had been tested by fire and emerged with a dignity that most people would never possess, even if they lived 100 years untouched by hardship. And as his words poured forth in the firelit study, Catherine felt the walls she had built around her heart. Those careful fortifications constructed brick by brick over 7 years of protective isolation begin to crumble like ancient ramparts finally surrendering to an inevitable siege, and tears spilled down her cheeks as she admitted, in a voice that trembled with the weight of confession, that she had been falling in love with him, almost from that first waltz, when he had looked at her as though she were precious rather than ruined. But she had been too afraid to believe it could be real, too conditioned by years of shame to trust that a man like him could truly want a woman like her, too certain that eventually he would see what Viscount Hartley had seen and find her lacking in some essential way she could never name or remedy. And the Duke caught her tears with his thumbs and told her that Hartley had been a fool and a coward who had looked at a young girl and failed to see the extraordinary woman she would become. And then he kissed her with a tenderness that seemed to contain all the devotion he had demonstrated through powder and shot at dawn, but transmuted into something infinitely gentler, and Catherine kissed him back with 7 years of loneliness and longing dissolved into this single moment of connection. And when they finally drew apart, both were trembling and both understood that something irrevocable had shifted between them, and the Duke stepped back only long enough to reach into his waistcoat pocket and produce a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the firelight and threw blue sparks across the study walls, and he told her he had been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the moment when she would be ready to believe in his devotion, waiting for her to see herself as he had seen her from the very beginning. And then he knelt before her in formal proposal and asked if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, his duchess, his partner in all things for whatever years they were granted. And Catherine looked down at this formidable man on his knees before her and said yes, through tears that were no longer born of shame or sorrow, but of relief and joy, so profound she could scarcely breathe, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to embrace her, she wept against his chest and felt him hold her as though she were the most valuable thing in his world. And for the first time in 7 years, Catherine Sinclair allowed herself to believe that perhaps she was. The engagement announcement appeared in the morning newspapers 3 days after the Duke's proposal and sent shockwaves through a society that had learned through 7 duels not to voice objections openly, yet still harbored countless private reservations about a match between one of England's most powerful peers and a woman they had spent 7 years dismissing as ruined goods. But no one dared speak against it, where the Duke might hear, and so the whispers remained confined to private drawing rooms, while public congratulations flowed toward Ashwood Hall with all the sincerity of a river forced to run uphill, and Catherine read the notices with hands that trembled slightly as she held the newsprint and realized that her name was now linked irrevocably with his in formal black letters that declared to all of England what he had already proven, through powder and shot, that she was worthy of being called his betrothed, his intended, his future Duchess. Wedding preparations began immediately under the careful orchestration of the Duke's household staff and Catherine's elderly aunt, who threw herself into the planning with an energy no one had seen from her in years, and as the weeks passed, Catherine observed her own transformation with a wonder that bordered on disbelief, for she found herself holding her head higher when she walked through the village, smiling more freely when she encountered neighbors who had once whispered behind their hands about her shame, reclaiming spaces she had avoided for years like the lending library and the better shops where ladies of quality gathered, and though some still watched her with poorly concealed judgment, she discovered that their opinions no longer had the power to wound her as they once had, for she wore the Duke's sapphire ring on her finger and carried the certainty of his love, like armor, against the arrows of social censure. The Duke involved her in every decision about their future, with a respect that astonished her, asking her opinion on which of his properties would become their primary residence, consulting her about household arrangements and staff appointments, even having his solicitor present marriage contracts that gave her an unusual degree of financial independence and legal autonomy, for he made it clear that he wanted not a decorative wife who would defer to his judgment in all things, but rather an equal partner who would share in the governance of their life together, and Catherine felt something fundamental shift within her as she realized that he truly meant to treat her as a person of worth and agency rather than as property acquired through marriage. One afternoon in late winter, her aunt found her in the morning room reviewing fabric samples for new curtains at Thornfield Park, and the elderly woman stopped in the doorway with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, and when Catherine looked up in alarm, her aunt simply shook her head and said through her weeping that she had despaired of ever seeing this day, had spent 7 years watching her beloved niece retreat further into protective isolation, and had prayed nightly for some miracle that would restore Catherine to the happiness she deserved, and now to witness her planning a wedding to a man who so clearly treasured her was more than she had ever dared hope for, and Catherine rose and embraced her aunt, and felt tears slip down her own cheeks as she understood how many people had carried the weight of her shame alongside her, how her suffering had radiated outward to touch all who loved her, and how her healing would likewise be a gift to them as well as to herself. The wedding took place on a crystalline winter morning at the Duke's private chapel on the grounds of his secondary estate, a ceremony deliberately intimate, despite his rank and the social expectation that a man of his standing would marry with all the pomp and pageantry that English aristocracy could muster. But the Duke had been immovable in his insistence that this day belong only to them and to those who had truly supported Catherine through her years of exile from polite society, and so the small stone chapel with its ancient stained glass and worn wooden pews held only 36 souls, when Catherine walked down the aisle on her elderly aunt's arm, dressed in ivory silk that caught the winter sunlight, streaming through the windows, and transformed her into something luminous. She wore no veil, for she had told the Duke she was done with hiding, and her dark hair was dressed simply with pearl pins and a single spray of hothouse roses, and as she moved toward the altar where he waited in formal black, she felt none of the trembling uncertainty that had characterized so much of her life for the past 7 years, but instead a calm certainty that seemed to root itself in her very bones. And when her eyes met his across the distance of the aisle, she saw that his were already bright with unshed tears. This formidable man, who had faced 7 opponents at dawn, without flinching, now undone, by the sight of her walking toward him to pledge her life to his. The ceremony itself was deeply emotional. In its simplicity, the familiar words of the Anglican service, spoken by a bishop who had known the Duke since childhood, and who had agreed to perform the wedding despite the raised eyebrows of his peers. And when they exchanged their vows, both Catherine and the Duke had tears streaming openly down their faces, for they understood better than most what these promises meant, how much they were entrusting to each other, how this public declaration was both an ending of what had been and a beginning of what would be. And when the bishop pronounced them man and wife, and the Duke kissed his bride with exquisite tenderness, the small congregation erupted in applause that echoed off the stone walls. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of the estate, a room decorated with greenery and white roses and warmed by massive fireplaces, and Catherine sat at the high table beside her husband, she thought, with wonder, and watched as their guests celebrated with genuine joy rather than the forced politeness that had characterized so many social gatherings she had endured. And when the Duke rose to toast his bride, he told the assembled company that Catherine was the bravest person he had ever known, that her quiet dignity in the face of unjust cruelty had taught him what true nobility meant, and that he considered it the greatest honor of his life that she had consented to be his wife. And Catherine wept again as she heard herself described not as ruined or damaged or fortunate to have been rescued, but as worthy and brave and honorable. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they departed for Thornfield Park in the Duke's carriage, wrapped in fur-lined travelling cloaks against the winter cold, and Catherine watched the frozen landscape pass by the windows and marvelled at the transformation of her circumstances, that she was now the Duchess of Thornfield, travelling to her new home, that the man beside her holding her hand was her husband, that she was loved and cherished and valued in ways she had once believed would be forever beyond her reach. And when the Duke lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her fingers, she looked at him with eyes that held no more shadows of doubt, but only the clear light of acceptance and joy. The early weeks of marriage at Thornfield Park unfolded like the gradual opening of a flower that had been too long denied sunlight, and Catherine discovered that becoming the Duchess of Thornfield meant not simply acquiring a title, but rather stepping into a role that her husband seemed genuinely determined to share with her rather than to impose upon her. For from their first morning waking together in the grand ducal apartments with winter light streaming through leaded windows, he made it clear that he wanted her voice in all decisions regarding their household and estates, consulting her about matters that most men of his rank would have considered far beyond a wife's proper sphere of interest. The Duke's tenderness in private was a revelation that left Catherine breathless with wonder. This man, who maintained such a formidable reputation in society, and whose name was still spoken with cautious respect after the 7 duels, he had fought for her honor, became in their private chambers a husband of exquisite gentleness, who touched her as though she were precious beyond measure, and spoke to her with an openness that made her understand how thoroughly he had dismantled his own walls in order to invite her into the innermost chambers of his heart, and their growing physical intimacy was rendered not as conquest or mere duty, but as a mutual exploration of trust and desire that left Catherine understanding for the first time that her body was not something shameful or ruined, but rather a source of joy and connection. Yet her adjustment to being mistress of a grand estate brought its own challenges, and she encountered her first real test when the estate steward, a man named Hoskins who had served the Duke's family for 30 years, came to her with a quarterly report and proceeded to explain matters in the simplified, condescending tone one might use with a child, clearly assuming that the new Duchess would be a decorative figurehead with no real authority or intelligence, and Catherine felt the old familiar shame beginning to rise before she remembered that she was no longer the ruined girl of Ashwood Hall, but rather the wife of a man who had proven repeatedly that he valued her worth. When the Duke returned from riding the estate boundaries that afternoon, Catherine told him quietly about the steward's manner, expecting perhaps that he would speak to Hoskins privately, but instead he immediately summoned the man to his study and informed him with icy precision that the Duchess had full authority over all household matters and substantial input into estate decisions, that her word was to be received as equivalent to the Duke's own, and that any future condescension would result in immediate dismissal regardless of years of service. And Hoskins left the study pale-faced, while Catherine stood witnessing this defense and felt something powerful unfurl within her. the recognition that she was not just surviving anymore, but actually thriving, that she had authority and agency, and the full support of a man who refused to allow anyone, even long-serving retainers, to diminish her. The weeks passed in a gradual accumulation of such moments, each one building upon the last, until Catherine realized with startling clarity. One evening, as she sat beside her husband, reviewing agricultural reports, that she was not just loved but genuinely cherished, that he sought her opinion because he valued her mind, that he touched her hand across the desk because her presence brought him joy, and that she had somehow crossed an invisible threshold from the girl who believed herself unworthy of love into a woman who was learning to accept it as her natural right. Spring arrived at Thornfield Park like a benediction, bringing with it the unfurling of cherry blossoms in the orchard and the return of songbirds to the ancient oaks that lined the drive. And as the season turned, Catherine and the Duke prepared to attend their first major London social season as a married couple, a prospect that filled Catherine with complex emotions she had not anticipated, for though she was now the Duchess of Thornfield and secure in her husband's devotion, the thought of facing society in the very ballrooms where she had once been whispered about and pitied stirred old memories that she had believed were finally laid to rest. Yet when they arrived at their London townhouse and began accepting invitations to the season's most prestigious events, Catherine discovered that everything had changed in ways both subtle and profound, for she no longer entered ballrooms as the ruined Lady Catherine Sinclair skulking at the periphery, but rather as Her Grace the Duchess of Thornfield, on the arm of a man whose reputation and recent history had made it abundantly clear that disrespect toward his wife would be met with immediate and uncompromising consequences, and the transformation in how society treated her was so complete as to be almost disorienting. At their first major ball at Devonshire House, Catherine walked up the grand staircase beside her husband and felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them. But instead of the contemptuous dismissal or pitying glances she had once endured, she saw only deference and careful respect, and as they moved through the crush of guests, people stepped aside to allow them passage and greeted her with bows and curtsies that acknowledged her rank, but also, she sensed, the particular care required when addressing the woman for whom the formidable Duke of Thornfield had fought 7 duels in defense of her honor. The evening's most significant moment came when Lady Beatrice Holwell, whose cruel comparison of Catherine to second-hand goods had resulted in her brother facing the Duke at dawn and receiving a bullet graze to his arm, approached Catherine near the refreshment tables with an expression of practiced contrition and offered what was clearly meant to be a fawning apology, speaking in honeyed tones about how she had been misunderstood, how she had always admired Catherine's grace, how she hoped they might put past misunderstandings behind them and perhaps even become friends. Catherine listened to this performance with a composure that surprised even herself, and when Lady Beatrice finally fell silent, Catherine responded with cool grace that was neither cruel nor welcoming, thanking her for her words but making no promises of friendship or future intimacy, her tone perfectly polite, yet containing an unmistakable quality of dismissal that made it clear she had moved beyond needing or seeking the approval of women who had once scorned her. And as Lady Beatrice retreated with uncertain steps, Catherine felt her husband's hand settle warmly at the small of her back and turned to find him watching her with an expression of unmistakable pride. That night, as they returned to their townhouse in the pre-dawn darkness, Catherine sat beside her husband in their carriage and told him quietly that she was finally, truly free of the shame she had carried for 7 years, that walking through those ballrooms tonight, she had felt no echo of the old pain, no residual belief in her own unworthiness, and as tears slipped down her cheeks, she realized they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than sorrow, for she had been given the rarest of gifts, not rescue from her circumstances, but rather the steady, unwavering belief of another person until she learned to believe in herself. 2 years had passed since Catherine became the Duchess of Thornfield, and in that time she had transformed from a woman learning to accept her own worth into someone fully established in both her position and her sense of self, respected throughout society, not merely for her rank, but for the intelligence and compassion she brought to every endeavor, and she had discovered within herself a calling that gave profound meaning to her new life. She had become a quiet but determined advocate for other women facing social ruin, offering them employment in her household or on the ducal estates, providing letters of reference that carried the weight of her position, and creating opportunities for redemption that society would otherwise have denied them. For she understood intimately what it meant to be judged irredeemable, and she refused to allow other women to suffer that fate when she possessed the power to intervene. The most visible symbol of her transformation and happiness was the child she and the Duke had been blessed with, a daughter named Eleanor who had inherited her father's dark eyes and her mother's gentle spirit, and on a golden afternoon in late summer, Catherine stood at the window of the nursery watching a scene that filled her heart with such fullness she could scarcely breathe. Her formidable husband, the Duke who had fought 7 duels in defense of her honor and whose name was still spoken with careful respect throughout England, was sprawled on the carpet of their private sitting room with their 2-year-old daughter climbing across him with fearless delight, his deep laughter mingling with Eleanor's bright giggles as he pretended to be a horse or perhaps a dragon vanquished by a brave princess. And Catherine marveled at how utterly her life had been transformed from those grey autumn days at Ashwood Hall when she had believed herself destined for permanent isolation and shame. Her elderly aunt had come to visit from Ashwood Hall, which Catherine had inherited upon her aunt's insistence that it should return to her as part of her marriage settlement, and as the 2 women took tea together in the conservatory, her aunt reached across to clasp Catherine's hand with tears in her eyes and spoke of miracles, of never having dared to hope that her beloved niece would find such happiness after the cruel abandonment that had defined so many years of her youth. But Catherine gently corrected this characterization with words she had come to believe. With her whole heart, it was not a miracle, she explained, but rather the result of finding someone who saw her true worth and refused to let the world diminish it, who had believed in her with such unwavering conviction that she eventually learned to believe in herself. And while the 7 duels he fought had certainly declared his intentions to society, the real transformation had occurred in quieter moments, in conversations on terraces and in gardens, in the steady accumulation of respect and tenderness that had gradually rebuilt what cruelty had destroyed, until she understood that her worth had never actually been diminished by Viscount Hartley's abandonment or society's judgment. It had only been obscured, waiting for someone with clear enough vision to see what had always been there. 5 years had passed since the Duke of Thornfield fought his 7th and final duel, and on a warm afternoon in late spring, Catherine stood in the garden at Thornfield Park, watching her husband teach their daughter Eleanor how to identify the various herbs growing in the medicinal beds, his large, scarred hands gentle as he guided the child's small fingers to touch the soft leaves of lavender and breathe in its calming scent. And as Catherine observed this scene of domestic tranquility, she reflected on how utterly transformed their lives had become from those tense autumn days when society had whispered about the ruined Lady Catherine Sinclair and wondered what the formidable Duke could possibly want with damaged goods, and she understood now with perfect clarity what the 7 duels had truly represented. Not violence for its own sake, or even primarily about defending her honor in the abstract, but rather a man willing to challenge an unjust world for the woman he loved, willing to say through deliberate action that he would not tolerate a society that diminished her worth or allowed cruelty to go unanswered. And while she had initially been horrified by the bloodshed and convinced she was not worth such dramatic defense, she had gradually come to understand that her worth had never actually been in question except in her own wounded heart. For the Duke had seen from their first meeting across that assembly room exactly what she was, a woman of quiet strength and dignity who had survived judgment and emerged unbroken despite every reason to become bitter and small. Catherine's internal monologue, as she watched her family in the dappled sunlight, acknowledged a truth she had learned slowly over these years of marriage. She had not learned her worth from the Duke's defense of her, powerful as those gestures had been, but rather from his unwavering belief in her, a belief so steady and unshakable that it had gradually eroded her own conviction of unworthiness until she could finally see herself as he had always seen her: precious, strong, deserving of love and respect and every happiness. And she understood now that this was the real gift he had given her, not rescue from her circumstances, but rather patient faith until she could believe in herself. And as Eleanor ran to her mother with a handful of lavender sprigs, and the Duke followed with that particular smile he reserved only for his family, Catherine felt such contentment that she could scarcely contain it, for she had found not just love but redemption, not just a husband but a partner who had fought for her in every sense until the world bent to accommodate the truth he had always known. Dear listener, Perhaps you too have known what it means to be judged by others and found wanting, to carry shame that was never truly yours to bear, to believe the cruel assessments of a world that measures worth by arbitrary standards and shows little mercy to those who fall short of impossible ideals. And if this is so, then know that Catherine's story is not merely a historical romance, but rather a reminder that we are not defined by others' failure to see our value, that true worth exists independent of recognition or validation, and that the most transformative relationships are those in which we are seen completely flaws and scars, and complicated histories included, and loved, not despite these things, but as the complete beings we are. For we all deserve someone who will fight for us, whether through dramatic gestures or quiet daily choices, someone who refuses to accept the world's dismissal of our worth and believes in us with such conviction that we eventually learn to believe in ourselves. The courage it takes to accept love when you have been taught you are unworthy cannot be understated, for it requires dismantling carefully constructed walls and risking the very abandonment you have learned to expect. But it is in this courageous vulnerability that we find our truest selves and our deepest peace. And so may you find, as Catherine did, that the shame you carry is not a permanent stain, but rather a temporary shadow that dissipates in the presence of genuine love. And may you discover your own redemption in the eyes of someone who sees past society's judgments to the truth of who you are. And may you rest tonight, knowing that you too are worthy of being fought for, defended, cherished, and above all, deeply and permanently loved.